Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel for some more Witcher content. With the second season in production, I thought it might be fun to do some Season 1 specific content to go along with the rewatch of the show. So I thought of this new series, One Meaningful Change, where I will highlight one specific change the show has made per episode, and analyze the meaning behind the change and what impact it has on the adaptation as a whole. I'll be keeping the promise I made last week. We'll be going back to Geralt's story. We'd already touched on some of Yennefer's storyline from this episode with my last video, and Ciri only gets a single scene in episode 3, so Geralt was a good choice anyways. However, I'm not going to be diving too deep into some of the subjects you might expect. For example, I'm not going to be talking about Strigas in detail or explaining this Striga's storyline, so I've already done a video about that monster's lore, and you should check it out if that's what you'd like to see. I could discuss how the story was changed from a fairly straightforward monster fight into a mystery story, but I don't think it'll be super meaningful in the long term, since it doesn't show Geralt developing to be an ace detective or anything. Geralt is able to use his Witcher knowledge and senses to solve the whole mystery pretty easily in both stories. Uh, I'm also not going to talk about Triss being in the episode when she wasn't in the books. Her being there doesn't change too much, makes some sense canonically, and ultimately it seems like she was added in just to give her some additional screen time for when she needs to be brought back into Geralt's story later on. But enough about what I'm not going to talk about. What I am going to talk about is politics. Now, before you click away, I'm not going to be talking about my political opinions about the show's production, casting, writing, or anything else like that. Those are important discussions to have, but are way outside of the view of my 10-minute episode recaps. What I would like to discuss is how the politics and political systems were tweaked for this adaptation, what that means now, and what that might be setting up going forward. In particular, this episode highlights some differences in how commoners are framed in the show versus in the books. The show starts us off with a haunting, heartbreaking scene of a dying boy telling his father and an unknown witcher about the monster who mortally wounded him, which he believes is a Vukadlak. The boy dies, and his father gives the witcher 3,000 orens to kill the creature, who leaves for his mission as the father cries over his son's corpse. We can tell that this father and son are not wealthy. They're commoners. Their clothes are rough, the room is small and poorly lit, they're both dirty, and the boy's wounds haven't even been tended to. These people have been hard done by, and in their grief and desperation have managed to raise a large amount of money in hopes of getting some relief from the horror. Unfortunately for them, the Witcher they hire isn't any help, and that's the last time they ever hear from him. By contrast, the books start off with Geralt getting a drink and trying to get a room at an inn in the rough part of town. When he's told there are no rooms and that he should go elsewhere, he insists that he'd rather stay here and is able to pay up front. At this point, 3 random patrons of the bar tell Geralt to leave, call him a Rivian vagabond, and insult him some more. The innkeeper notably doesn't interfere, and even thinks to himself that he also doesn't like Rivians. After more insults, the men knock the beer from Geralt's hand and move to punch him. Instead of escaping, or even beating up the 3 men, Geralt draws his sword and kills them all before they can even react. This obviously terrifies the other bar patrons. The guards show up to arrest him. Even now, Geralt doesn't back down, and he refuses to surrender his weapon. He bewitches the guards with a sign and commands them to bring him to the castellan, which they do. Geralt definitely shows little regard for human life here, but we also see that in the books, commoners are often xenophobic, even towards other northerners. They don't even seem to know that Geralt is a witcher or mutant or anything of the sort, but are willing to insult and beat him up for asking for a room in the wrong part of town. Back to the show, we see that this version of Geralt is staying at an inn with a prostitute, ignoring her as she talks. After examining his scars and talking about all the stories she's heard about him, she mentions that another witcher came through not too long ago, took a 3,000 oren bounty from some miners in Temeria, and then ran away with the money. This catches Geralt's attention, so Geralt pays her for her services and the information as the innkeeper bursts in. Geralt has been staying at the inn for 3 nights without paying, and the innkeeper throws him out. Instead of confronting the innkeeper or using a sign to bewitch him and getting out of the bill, Geralt packs up and promises to pay the innkeeper when he returns from Temeria, and leaves his horse at the inn as collateral. Instead of being a badass anti-hero who kills at the slightest provocation, Show Geralt is presented as kind of pathetic in his dealings with regular people. He doesn't seem to have skimped out on his room bill due to contempt, but because he wanted to pay for companionship instead, and didn't have enough money to do both. Going to Temeria and taking the job seems like it will help him secure some financial stability, settle his debts, and help some people with their pest problem, and maybe help fix the reputation of Witchers too. This sequence shows us that Geralt is informed of the bounty by a commoner, that he lives like a commoner, and that he's going to claim a bounty that was raised by a group of desperate commoners. It could be that Geralt liking commoners just makes him more sympathetic to modern audiences, but these changes mean that the whole start of the plot is driven by commoners, and this isn't the end of their involvement in it. In the books, when Geralt is brought to the Castellan, the murder of the 3 commoners is only briefly discussed before they start talking about the bounty. The Castellan deduces that Geralt only killed the men in order to show off how good he is at killing, and essentially lets Geralt off the hook for his crimes. This reinforces how little Book Geralt cares about commoners, and how he also knows that nobles care about commoners even less than he does. The Castellan explains the whole backstory to Geralt up front. Everything is covered. The incest, the death of Princess Ada, Foltest's daughter becoming a Striga, having to abandon the palace, Foltest's 3,000 Orin bounty, the method of curing her, and the many failed attempts to cure her. All of this information is given freely to Geralt, which implies none of it is much of a secret. Why is this important? Because in the show, all of this is a secret, and it's because Foltest and his court fear the commoners will rise up if they knew the truth. We see evidence of this when Geralt goes to meet the miners, and they're discussing striking, leaving the kingdom altogether, or even armed rebellion. They look to Nilfgaard as an example, saying that the usurper rallied the people against a corrupt king, and took back what was theirs. This version of King Foltest is between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, the commoners believe the king is unable to deal with an unknown monster, which the miners assume is a Vukudlak. This makes him look weak and uncaring. On the other hand, telling them the truth, that the monster was his incest-born daughter all along, would place the blame right onto his family, and would be even more directly his fault than his indifference has been. In the books, the common people are not one of Foltest's considerations at all. That's because the commoners there are painted in a very different light. As I mentioned earlier, the commoners are xenophobic in the books, but in more nuanced ways than we see in the show. Now, the show does a great job of showing that commoners and humans are bigoted against elves and other non-humans, which is true in the books too. What it doesn't really explore is how the common people are suspicious of anyone from outside of their own kingdom, and have a special fear of the southern empire of Nilfgaard. The books go to some lengths to show that most of the time, commoners are fairly unaware of worldly topics, and are uninterested in ideas like equality, social mobility, or human rights. They may have gripes and grumbles about their king, but they don't usually see their own political engagement as the solution to the problems caused by their rulers. So King Foltest might seem ineffectual, gross, and scary to common people, what with the incest and his monster daughter killing dozens of people a year with no relief in sight. But there are no miners revolting or malicious organizing to get rid of him. Instead, the books tell us that a group of nobles are concerned about the whole situation, and are organizing to have the Striga killed, or else have a king of a nearby kingdom depose him instead. Ostrit is part of that group of nobles in the books, and he tries to bribe Geralt to leave without confronting the Striga at all. If Geralt isn't able to solve the problem, the nobles will eventually be forced to attempt to depose Foltest, which would complete Ostrit's revenge. This is very similar to Ostrich's plan in the show, where he breaks up Geralt's discussion with the miners about getting a contract for their Vukudlak problem. It's important to note that Ostrich let the miners discuss treason without punishment, but then tries to have Geralt escorted to the border using the story about the other Witcher running off with the miners' money as an excuse. He's essentially trying to let things get so bad that the common people, not some nobles or a foreign army, will rise up to depose Foltest themselves. In another show only scene, Geralt and Triss come back to Ostrich after discovering Ada's hidden letter, and he tries to convince Triss and Geralt that maybe Foltest had actually raped Ada and cursed the child to cover it up. This doesn't work thanks to Geralt's sense of smell, but Ostrich was essentially trying to smear Foltest and protect Ada's memory in the eyes of the people, once again showing that what the common people think is important to the nobles in the show. In the end, Ostrich is killed by the Striga he created, and how Ostrich's death is treated is another reflection of our theme. In the books, Ostrich's death isn't even mentioned to Geralt after the fact. Ostrich might have been considered another hapless volunteer trying to cure Ada, or he might have been exposed. The book just doesn't seem to care to say. Geralt just asks about his sword, his money, and the princess, then goes back to sleep. The show, however, makes a point to say that the king has declared that Ostrich was the one who killed the Vukudlak, and that the miners are building a statue in Ostrich's honor. Furthermore, Geralt is getting no credit, and the princess who was cured has been sent away so as not to arouse suspicion. It's obviously very important to the show's writers that we know that the miners have been pacified by yet another series of lies from the king, who now never has to reveal his dirty little secret and face a revolution. And how Foltest is generally presented in the show also demonstrates how we are supposed to sympathize with the commoners in this episode. He is notably older, overweight, sweaty, and his crown is askew. When we first see Foltest in the show, he is digging into a feast alone while his captain of the guard does all the talking for him. He is then locked into a room with Geralt, where he refuses to confirm Geralt's suspicion of the monster being his Striga or his daughter, and tries to have Geralt sent away again. He comes off as very dislikable and cowardly, and stands in his own way with his lies and denials. This is a far cry from the forceful, youthful, and self-assured Foltest in the books, who owned up to his attraction to his sister from the start, admitted that his daughter was the Striga causing the trouble, and outlawed the killing of the Striga under penalty of death. Now, it could just be that the showrunners wanted to show a man who committed incest with his sister in a more unfavorable light, which is understandable given their audience's sensibilities, but this grosser version of Foltest is almost an anti-monarchy stereotype now, instead of the more complicated version from the books. Now, I'm not trying to present this as a book peasants bad, book kings good, show peasants good, show kings bad kind of thing. It's more of a book peasants meaner, book kings friendlier, show peasants deeper, show kings shallower. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the episode with an especially gross king also has a lot of focus on the common people, and them mentioning Nilfgaard and revolution seem to be building to something. We haven't seen enough of Nilfgaard to know exactly how its society and government work, but it is being presented as an alternative to the northern kingdoms that the common folk are willing to consider. The show seems to be setting up an ideological conflict between Nilfgaard and the northern kingdoms, one where all people, noble and common, may be choosing between their kings and something else. Is it possible that Nilfgaard might see popular support from some humans in the show? Could one or more kingdoms revolt in imitation of Nilfgaard? Will the common people continue to flex their economic and political muscles in future stories? Let's continue the discussion down in the comments. Whether it's about this episode or anything else in Season 1, I'd love to know what you think. If you liked the video, drop a like and subscribe to A Storm of Stories for the rest of The Witcher's meaningful changes and more. Thanks, and I hope to see you for the next one.